look. So here's the way we're going to use hits, and there are several ways to determine the approved stock. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to determine the number of hits for each inventory item for a given period. A lot of people will use a year, depending on the amount of time that an item typically turns over or stays within your active selling inventory is what you want to use as a time period here. So for example, if you're in the cell phone business and you have new cell phones come out that obsolete a tremendous number of cell phones every month, you might use a month as this number of hits calculation period. If you're in a fairly stable business that you sell pretty much the same models year in and year out, you have some model protection from your vendor so that you can return obsolete models and not have to stock them, then you might decide to use a year period. You might even decide to use longer. Typically don't use longer than a year. All right, the second thing we want to do is we want to sort in order by the decreasing number of hits. So I want the most hits at the top and the least number of hits at the bottom. Then once we have that, we're going to divide them, and I'm going to show you the percentages in a minute, into A, B, C, D, and X items. Once we divide them into those categories, we're going to evaluate the adjusted margin contribution of each item. And then we'll evaluate the related item sales, the relationship between the item and other items to make the final decision. So we have the ranking report, and here's typically the way we're going to divide the items on the ranking report. The top 80% of the items get an A ranking. The next 15% get a B ranking. The next 4% get a C ranking, and the last 1% get a D ranking, and finally items on the list that have no hits in the period get an X ranking. So we want to sort them in decreasing order. First 80% A, next 15 B, next 4 C, D's are the last one, and notice the percentages in the top add up to 100%. So it's the top 80% of hits. There's some other things that we can use to rank these items and split them based on percentage if the number of hits doesn't really work for a particular product. And we have to look at the product to decide which product is one applies to and which one doesn't. Typically, these are going to apply by business. So most businesses will use number of hits. Some may need to use other items. For example, cost of goods sold. Again, rank them in descending order by cost of goods sold, which is going to give you basically a measure of the items that you pay the most for during the course of the year. You can rank by sales dollars, which a lot of companies do. I would say be careful with sales dollars, because items that you have ordered a lot, that are very frequent orders, may not be high dollar items, but you may need to stock them, not because of what they cost or what they sell for, but because you get orders for them all the time. You can also rank by margin percentage and return on investment margin, and we'll have a look at how to calculate all of those here in a minute. So let's take a look at some items. We've got sales and cost figures and a margin and a percentage. And so the question is, which item would you stock? Now, obviously looking at this, we might say, well, I definitely stock the last item that's a 50% margin, and the second item that's a 40% margin, and the others, the negative 1% margin, I definitely not stock, and the top one I might stock or I might not, just depending on what it was and how critical it was. But let's take a look at that a little different way, because there's more than the cost of the item, that is the direct cost of the item, what you pay the vendor for the item, than just that number. So let's take a look at the value of the inventory. That is, how much inventory you maintain of the item in order to make those sales. So here, obviously, the $12,500 item we have more invested in than we do the $2,000 item or the $4,500 cost item. Now remember again, I'll go back to the previous slide. Remember what the percentages are here. We've got a big margin in this big dollar item. But when we get over here, we also have a big investment in the inventory. All right, so let's take a look at the margin divided by the inventory and look at actually return on investment. So now the top item that only had a 29% margin actually looks pretty good because the return on investment in inventory is 26%. The second item is a definite yes at 92%. And the last item doesn't look quite as good now because in order to make that margin, I had to stock a large dollar amount of inventory, or I am stocking a large dollar amount of inventory. All right, so the next thing we need to know, the next number we need to know is the carrying cost, or K, which is adding together all the costs involved in maintaining inventory in the warehouse. So this is the cost of the personnel to handle the stock, whether they're putting it away or moving the material, the insurance and the taxes you have to pay on the inventory, the rent and the utilities on the warehouse that you have to use to store material, or the interest on the mortgage that you use to buy the warehouse, and the repairs and maintenance on the warehouse, the money that you spend taking a physical inventory and cycle counting, because if you stock it, you got to count it. Inventory shrinkage and obsolescence, how much of it walks out the back door or falls off the dock. And lastly, the opportunity cost of the money invested in inventory. That could be interest cost if you're borrowing money to stock inventory. But it could also be the answer to the question, suppose I had this $75,000 or $100,000. What else could I invest in? And don't think in terms of just interest-bearing vehicle stocks, bonds, put it in the money market. Think in terms of building a new factory, hiring a new salesperson, doing additional marketing. So the real question here is, well, what could I use the money that I'm investing in inventory to make other money, and what's the cost of that? So we need to come up with K. Now, Schreibfeder's research says that carrying cost is somewhere between 18.5% and 28%. So if you don't feel like calculating it, you could take an average of 18 and 28, maybe 23% is the number you decide to use. Or if you think yours is lower, maybe 20%. All right. So here's what we then do. We're going to do the adjusted margin calculation. All right. And this is done on an annual basis typically. Take the annual gross margin, that's the 800 in the example we've been working on from before, minus the average value of inventory times the carrying cost. Okay, so the average value of inventory times the carrying cost is the amount that it costs you to hold that value in inventory. And annual sales is the total sales of the item. So in this case, with the item on our chart that we had a margin of 800 in, our sales were 2,800. This is the first item. We take 800 minus the 3,000 inventory times our 20% carrying cost, which we're using as just kind of an average. So that's 600. So actually, we didn't make $800 on that item. We paid $600 for the privilege of having the inventory we needed to sell that item. And so now our adjusted margin is only 7.1% for that item. So now if you look at the numbers that we've calculated margin, which was 29% on this. We've calculated ROI, which is 26%, and we've calculated adjusted margin, which was 7.1%. Well, look at what happens down here on the bottom when we calculate adjusted margin using a 20% carrying cost. So you can see you can get dramatically different numbers from adjusted margin. Remember, the item that's showing negative 10% now was showing a 50% margin in the first calculation. So the adjusted margin is the amount you actually netted on that particular item. All right, here's the rule to determine whether an item is profitable or not. The adjusted margin, I'm just going to read it, adjusted margin must be greater than non-inventory related expense percentage. Okay, so if you take all the expenses that are non-inventory and divide that by total annual sales of the company, that's the percentage of expenses that you have to cover in order for the item to be profitable. So I add up the administrative cost and the other insurance and office warehouse, office space and supplies and so on and so forth. And I come up with a NIREP, and it does not vary within a location. It can vary from location to location, but it doesn't vary within a location. So if the adjusted margin is not bigger than, because I've already taken the inventory, here's the logic behind this. I've already taken the inventory costs out of the margin. Now I'm going to take the other costs, the other expenses out of that margin. And if I've got anything left, the item is profitable. If I don't, the item is unprofitable. So, A items, we stock. B items, we stock. That's the first 95% of the list, basically. Now, we've got to look at C, D, and X items. And here are the questions we've got to ask. What's the profit margin on the item? Will you lose the sale if you don't keep it? Will customer allow you to back order it? If you're the only source of that item in the United States, you're probably not going to have to stock it because you're not going to lose the sale if you don't get it. Now, if it's a 12-week lead time because it has to be manufactured in China and come across the water, you may have to stock the item in order for the customer not to say, well, if it's going to take you 3 months to get it for me, I'm going to have to come up with another alternative. Third item we've talked about, is there a related A or B item that you're going to stock, that you sell, that you need to keep a C or D item as a result of an accessory, an option, a repair kit, lubricating oil, something like that. The next question that you need to ask about a C, D, or X item is there something else besides this item that would work just as well that you can sell? And lastly, can you special order it? I know if you special order an item, typically you're going to have to pay, maybe you're going to have to pay accelerated freight. If you're ordering from a manufacturer or master distributor, there may be minimum order quantities or order dollar amounts that you have to meet. Otherwise, you get tacked on a percentage, and you need to calculate those into this equation. But if you can special order an item at a lower cost than your inventory carrying cost for the item, you should always special order the item and not ship it if you're not going to lose the sale. Okay. So that's the answer to the question, what to stock. That's how you get the answer to the question, what to stock. And we're going to stop there even though we're not at an hour. And the reason we're going to stop there is because once we get into the when to order and how much to order, that session is going to take quite a while to get through all those concepts. So at this point, we'll stop. We've covered inventory management. We will cover the rest of these questions in the next 2 sessions, and the next 2 sessions will most likely go the better part of an hour. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot them to me at some point. My email address, if you want that for later on, is Bob, B-O-B-P as in Palmer, at dgginc.com, and I'll put that up on the screen after I take this slide down.